And we will move on now to the second half of our panel. This is Philosophy as a Way of Life, Spirituality and Religion by Gianfranco Ferraro. Gianfranco of Open University has made several contributions to scholarship on Foucault, Hadot, and utopian studies, including but certainly not limited to founding and working as the editorial director of the journal called the Thomas Project, a border journal for utopian thoughts, editing with Marta, the book The Late Foucault, and coordinating the global history of utopias and translating works on utopian traditions, as well as I said, many other publications and current projects. So whenever you're ready, and you can have this mic.
Thank you very much. It's a really honor and a pleasure also to stay with you, and of course, thank you very much once again to Marta, Helder, and Pedro for the invitation. The honor and pleasure. It's not something, yeah, thank you. Something that we meet always, but in this occasion, it's not a formality, but really a reality, and I want to stress this. So, uh, whether or not philosophy as a way of life constitutes a form of spirituality has increasingly emerged as a crucial issue for defining philosophy as a way of life itself. This arises from the fact that both Foucault and Hadot viewed philosophy, when practiced as an art of living or an existential practice, as inherently spiritual. The significance of this issue becomes even more profound when we consider scholars like Cooper or Nussbaum, who argue that the philosophy as a way of life in antiquity is entirely distinct from spirituality, dismissing spirituality as merely a religious concern. The key challenge, in my view, lies in the fact that these two positions hinge on different conceptions of logos and the role of the psyche as the object of ancient philosophy. Cooper and Nussbaum's metaphilosophical stance interprets logos primarily as a discursive reason and sees the philosophical work on the psyche as akin to a modern exploration of the mind, just as spirit has often been translated into English by a long philosophical tradition. Conversely, Hadot and Foucault interpreted the ancient notion of logos as a part of a more complex system, where discourse itself can be seen as a practice, and the notion of spirit becomes much more problematic, not reducible to the mind. These two perspectives are thus rooted in distinct philosophical traditions of modernity, and even in different traditions of translation. So, first, I will explore how Foucault and Hadot present philosophy as way of life closely connected to spirituality, and briefly highlight how this contrasts with the perspectives of Nussbaum and Cooper. Second, I will examine how Foucault and Hadot distinguish spirituality from religion and briefly trace the historical roots of their conception of spirituality. I will then demonstrate how engaging in spirituality allows for the development of a notion of spirituality that is not necessarily tied to religious concerns. I will briefly mention other practices beyond religious or philosophical ones where spiritual moments can be experienced, with an emphasis on the role of imagination. Uh, well, Next, I will show how the decisive element in any spirituality is conversion, and how Hadot and Foucault's texts reveal that conversion is central to spirituality and consequently to philosophy understood as spirituality. I will also refer to an anthropological aspect that distinguishes conversion and thus spirituality. Finally, I will propose a possible topography or of different forms of spirituality. Well, today I will focus specifically on points 1, 2, 5, and 6. To approach, first point, to approach Pierre Hadot's notion of a spiritual exercise and Foucault's view of spirituality as intrinsic to the practice of self-care or a technology of the self, both in antiquity and in certain modern philosophical, religious, political, or artistic phenomena, have repositioned spirituality as a central and foundational element in the debate on philosophy as way of life. Their approach diverges significantly in their starting points. Hadot begins by directly engaging with the philosophical landscape of antiquity, and it is through a detailed examination of this context, particularly to address some of its inherent contradictions, that he develops the concept of philosophy as way of life and philosophical spirituality. Foucault, on the other hand, does not focus primarily on, on philosophy itself, but rather on the broader practice of truth or veridiction. The Delphi commandment, note thyself, appears to the latter as a key element of the broader practice of self-care, or care of self. Let us now examine how the concept of spirituality emerges in the work of these two authors. The case of Adon, spiritual exercises. It is nevertheless necessary to use this term, I believe, because none of the other adjectives we could use, psychic, moral, ethical, intellectual, of thought, of the soul, covers all the aspects of the reality we want to describe. Above all, the word spiritual reveals the true dimensions of these exercises. By means of them, the individual rises himself up to the life of the object spirit. That is to say, he replaces himself within the perspective of the whole, become eternal by transcending himself, yourself. Uh, According to Adorno, the definition of the spiritual is what allows for a broader scope of what is truly at stake in the practice of philosophy and the transformation that philosophy makes possible through a transcendence that the subject performs towards a perspective of the whole. On its part, Foucault defines the spiritual as the set of researches, practice, and experiences which may be purifications, ascetic exercise, renunciations, conversions, overlooking, modification of the existence, etc., which are not for knowledge, but for the subject's very being, the price to be paid for access to the truth. According to Foucault, spirituality is thus a series of trials, experiences that the subject undergoes in pursuit of truth. It is something that accompanies existence in a tension toward truth. However, in this tension, existence does not remain the same, but undergoes transformation. Spirituality is therefore not something abstract, but rather the way in which a care of the self occupies this tension. It does so through techniques of the self, technique to view, technique de soi, techniques that for Foucault have as their object precisely the form in which one lives, the choice of this form. A term, technique de soi, which Adorno for his part rejects. However, in both authors, there is a shared and clear element. Spirituality reveals a fundamental openness of existence to its own transformation, through the tension expressed by the perspective of the whole according to Adorno, and truth according to Foucault. Point 2. According to John Cooper, the notion of philosophy as way of life in antiquity would not have a spiritual foundation. At the heart of Cooper's metaphilosophy is a fundamental axiom. It is logos, understood as a philosophical and rational discourse that is essential for life choices and consequently for the very connection between philosophy and life. Practice are entirely irrelevant in this view. However, an important aspect to focus on immediately is the reason behind Cooper's criticism, the connection between spirituality and religion. For Cooper, Hadot inappropriately projects onto philosophy notions that pertain instead to religion. These projections include the notion of spiritual exercise, as we saw, which Hadot would have directly borrowed from St. Ignatius of Loyola to describe the practice of various philosophical schools, and two, the example of philosophy as well as life based on the practice of the Stoics and Neoplatonists, which, according to Cooper, would represent a decadent version of classical ancient philosophy, already imbued with religious elements and therefore in no way paradigmatic of the status of the ancient philosophy. According to Cooper, one should defend an almost historical purity of philosophy as a way of life in antiquity, a purity that resides entirely in logical rational argumentation, in discourse. Hadot, in truth, clearly separates his concept of spirituality from religion. We can see this, for example, in this text where he clearly highlights, following Rabu, how the notion from St. Ignatius is in reality a translation of concepts already present in ancient philosophy and later transposed into a religious context. And I quote, Ignatius' exercitia spiritualia are nothing but a Christian version of a Greek-Roman tradition. Both the idea and the terminology of exercitium spirituale are attested in early Latin Christianity, well before Ignatius of Loyola, and they correspond to the Greek Christian term ascesis. Calling the practices of antiquity spiritual exercise would therefore not be an appropriate transposition of a religious concept into a field inherently foreign to it, but rather the recovery of a notion practice of ancient spirituality which, born in a philosophical context, will be acquired and translated into religious language. Non-existent in Greco-Roman religion, spiritual ascetic exercise are instead part of philosophy and are adopted by Christianity precisely at the moment when it seeks to compete with philosophy on its own ground, namely that of a way of life. Thus, it is a Christian religion that incorporates philosophical spirituality, attributing a different goal to its exercises. Martha Nussbaum, for her part, contests the underlying thesis as it is presented in the third volume of Foucault's The History of Sexuality and his later lectures, that philosophy is a set of techniques de soi. Nussbaum argues that the practice of self-shaping do not distinguish philosophy. I quote, this the philosophers have in common with the religious and magical superstitious movement of various types in their culture. Instead, what characterizes ancient philosophy is, for her, the pursuit of logical validity, intellectual coherence, and truth delivers freedom from the tyranny of custom and convention. Yet, in the case of Foucault, the distinction between spirituality and religion appears, if you will, even more clear in one of the texts in which he reflects on the Iranian Revolution. The definition precedes Foucault's study of the tradition of the care of self, in which, for Foucault, the philosophical question of how to have access to the truth and the practice of spirituality were never separate. Well, and I quote precisely this text. When I speak of spirituality, I'm not referring to religion. It is essential to clearly distinguish between spirituality and religion. I'm astonished to see that spirituality, spiritualism, and religion form an incredible mix in people's mind, a kind of jam, an impossible confusion. Spirituality is something that can be found within religion, but also outside of it. It can be found in Buddhism, a religion without theology, in monotheistic traditions, but also in Greek civilization. What is spirituality? I believe it is a practice through which a person is displaced, transformed, unsettled, to the point of renouncing to her own individuality, to her position as a subject. Religions are both a kind of welcoming structure for this form of spirituality, for these spirituality practices, and also a limitation on them. They prescribe what one must become other than oneself, the direction one must take, and what new status one will attain, and so on. In short, religions constitute a codification of spirituality. So, If religion and spirituality appear distinguishable, is it possible to distinguish philosophy and spirituality? We will call, writes Foucault, philosophy the form of thought that asks what is that enables the subject to have access to the truth, and which attempts to determine the conditions and limits of the subject's access to the truth. If I call this philosophy, when I think we could call spirituality the search, practice, and experience through which the subject carries out the necessary transformations on himself in order to have access to the truth. Spirituality thus seems to be something that supports the active side of the rational search for truth in ancient philosophy. This is something we can also find religion, but oriented in a profoundly different direction. For Foucault, religious spirituality is characterized as a practice of renunciation and emptying of the self, while philosophical spirituality places the self and as the foundational element of the practice itself. To summarize all this, I would say briefly that this philosophical ascesis, the ascetic system, the meanings of which and some of its principal elements I have tried to give you, is not to all of the same type of Christian ascesis, the essential function of which is to determine and order the necessary renunciations leading up to the ultimate point of self-renunciation. Indeed, the very analysis of spiritual practices as form of self-constitution of the subject in antiquity makes clear the role that these practices play in relation to authority. If we think, for instance, of Foucault's studies on parrhesia and aleturgia, as the cynical practice is, as forms of a philosophical spirituality that challenge authority, it is perhaps fair to say that the Nussbaum may be projecting onto Foucault's conception of ancient spirituality the notion of disciplinary power he had developed in the 70s. Nevertheless, she overlooks the fact that Foucault's notion of power always includes the possibility of resistance. It is also a genealogy of a form of resistance and power that Foucault seeks to uncover in antiquity through his archaeology of philosophical practices. It's also important to recall that for Foucault, discourse is not an isolated, abstract system of thought. Rather, it is always connected to practical activities. In the archaeology of knowledge, Foucault develops the idea that the order of discourse is inseparable from practice. Discourse is not simply a set of rational arguments or abstract concepts. It is a discursive event, that's a quotation, that emerges from and transforms practice. It is important to recognize that the notion of spirituality that both Foucault and Hadot arrive at, and which they see as central to philosophy as way of life, is not an invention of the two authors. They are part of a long tradition where the concept of philosophy is intertwined with spirituality, especially when it is seen as inherently linked to the existence. In Foucault's case, the connection between his conception of philosophical spirituality and Hegel's phenomenology of spirit is evident. Hegel's work becomes the pinnacle of a Western philosophy conceived precisely as a philosophical spirituality, a common Hegelian trait that can be found also in Hadot, as demonstrated recently by Vesperini. As sources for his notion of spiritual exercise, Hadot refers to several key works. He mentioned an issue of the magazine Fontaine, published after World War II, titled La Poésie comme exercice spirituel. He also cites Beethoven's use of the notion of spiritual exercise as referenced by Elisabeth Brisson in her book Le Sacre du Musicien. Additionally, Hadot draws on the clarification provided by Paul Rabov in Selenture méthodique d'exercice in der Antike, which argues that St. Ignatius' spiritual exercise represents religious application of a concept already present in ancient philosophy. Hadot also mentions Louis Journet and Jean-Pierre Vernant, who apply this concept to ancient practices. Finally, it is worth adding George Friedman to this list, whose book La puissance et la sagesse is cited by Hadot in the epigraph of his essay on spiritual exercises. I believe it is important to emphasize the significance for Hadot of both Wittgenstein and Bergson. Hadot explains that he encountered Wittgenstein works in the 50s. It was his encounter with the philosophical investigations that proved decisive, as Hadot himself explains, for developing the concept of spiritual exercise, and thus a form of spirituality that is properly philosophical and not tied to religious experience. The key concept of Wittgenstein that was fundamental for Hadot is, of course, that of the language game. The account he provides in the preface to the collection of essays on Wittgenstein is enlightening. Uh, There was therefore not the language, but rather language games, always situated, Wittgenstein, within the perspective of a determined activity, a concrete situation, or a way of life. This idea helped me resolve the problem that was posed to me and indeed to many of my colleagues, the apparent incoherence of ancient philosophical authors. It was from this perspective that I began to speak of spiritual exercises. The role of the unspeakable and the ineffable within the Wittgenstein philosophical approach is another reason that attracts Hadot to the Venus philosopher. How, in fact, can mysticism, for example, as seen in literary forms of the sublime or the philosophical poetic genre, be explained outside of a religious context? Referring to some of his own experience which provoked to him the discovery of something moving and fascinating that was not connected to the Christian faith, Hadot remembers his mystical feeling toward the sky studded with stars and the view of the Alps from Lago Maggiore. These experiences led to his shift from religion to a view of philosophy as a transformation of the perception of the world. Hadot relates his impression to Roland's notion of the oceanic feeling. Hence, it is through this experience that Hadot perceives the ineffability of a certain existential experience, the awareness that what was most essential for us could not be expressed. A theme particularly dear to Wittgenstein. Now, the insistence with which Hadot refers to the notion of Roland in his dialogue with Carlier and Davidson is important because it helps us to understand how his own mystical experience, as interpreted by Hadot, is filtered through an author who, while identifying similar experiences as one of the essential premises of a religious experience, does not exhaust them in it. This notion would also be problematized by Roland's friend Sigmund Freud in The Civilization and its Discontents. If, according to Roland, the oceanic feeling would constitute, in Freud's words, the true source of religiosity, Freud attributes the origin of an oceanic feeling in adulthood to the persistence of that sense of connection with the world that precedes the formation of the ego. Hence, we observe here the perception of a mystical experience that can be in common in both religion and philosophy, but that is somehow rooted in a psychological phenomenon that precedes them, a substrate related to a fundamental anthropological, psychological experience. Beyond Roland concepts, Hadot ties his experience to a notion of authenticity, contrasted with everyday life as being in a world, and thus to a privileged state of awareness of our being in the world. This is an immediate intuition. This brings us to another of Hadot's influences, that of Henri Bergson, to whom he even dedicated his philosophy bachelor thesis, focused on one of Bergson's phrases. Philosophy is not a construction of a system, but a once-made decision to look narrowly inside oneself and around oneself. The decisive influence of Bergson concerning the notion of spirituality is clear when we examine some of his works. La pensée et le mouvement, the thought and the moving, where he presents an approach to spirituality as the subject of metaphysics, of philosophy and not of science, whose essential characteristic change can be learned primarily through intuition. Bergson's magnum opus, L'évolution créatrice, creative evolution, presents indeed philosophy as a discipline that leads one to spiritual life through fleeting intuitions. Another work by Bergson, L'énergie spirituelle, the spiritual energy, is directly dedicated to the question of the spirit. Here, Bergson identifies the spirit with consciousness, which is primarily memory, but also the anticipation of the future. From this comes the importance of attention. Attention is expectation, and there is no consciousness without a certain attentiveness to life, writes Bergson. Thus, in Bergson, the spirit already appears with the characteristic of a spiritual exercise like prosoche, akin to the early form of the care of the self. These excursus through the explicit sources of the notion of spirituality in Hadot and Foucault allows us to understand how, long before their conception of philosophical spirituality in relation to not only ancient but also modern tradition, various philosophical traditions take up the issue of spirituality within a strictly philosophical framework, or at least not necessarily tied to religious sphere. It seems to me that this excursus also allows us to identify two key elements of philosophical spirituality that will directly influence Hadot and Foucault conception of spirituality. A spirituality as a asceticism, an exercise connected to life, as an experience of inner transformation. Two, a spirituality as a primordial experience, pure intuition of an indefinite connection with the world as an experience of transcendence. So, rapidly, point 3 and 4, um, you will find that in my chapter, that ancient philosophy is not solely linked to logical rational elements, but is infused with spiritual questions as indicated by Hadot and Foucault, or moments when there is an actual indistinction between the philosophical and religious techniques can be inferred from the studies of other interpreters of classical antiquity. There are fundamentally two elements to consider in these regards. First, the notion of uh, sorry, first, the notion of logos. Second, the role of imagination in philosophy as well as in religion is significant, allowing us to draw from non-discursive but linguistic models even within philosophy. For example, it is in imagetics that we find precisely those mystical aspects of philosophy where philosophical discourse necessarily resorts to other realms, such as poetry or myth, without ceasing to be philosophy. In the ancient world, philosophical spirituality moved between proximity to religious phenomena, such as Pythagorean purification practice and the imagistic logic of Empedocles and Plato, and the growing differentiation. This gap later narrowed in Neoplatonism and early Christianity. Blurred boundaries between these forms of spirituality also reappeared at the start of the modern era. Additionally, poetry, biography, and utopia play significant roles in the philosophical tradition, all characterized by the use of imagery as seen in classical philosophy through myth. The forms of spirituality, according to the concepts that emerge from both Hadot and Foucault, can indeed be shown in contexts beyond the religious and philosophical. Hadot himself acknowledged that his notion of spiritual exercises partly stems from an expression used by Beethoven. In some contexts, it would refer to the functioning of spiritual exercises as being akin to the performance of a musical score. Hadot places significant emphasis on science and scientific conduct, particularly in his essays Physics as Spiritual Exercise and in the Veil of Isis. He highlights cosmological reflection as spiritual exercise, a practice dating back to antiquity and found in both philosophical poetry and physics. This tradition is revived in modernity through figures like Goethe and Leopard. Well, now, if we want to consider the central phenomenon that Hadot and Foucault identify in spirituality, what, in other words, characterizes philosophy. Thanks. Characterizes philosophy as way of life, what cannot be missing in a phenomenon that can be called spiritual as such, we see how both authors, despite their differences, identify it in the notion of conversion. The philosophical act is a conversion which turns our entire life upside down, changing the life of the person who goes through it. It raises the individual from an authentic condition of life darkened by unconsciousness and arrested by worry, to an authentic state of life in which he attains self-consciousness and exact vision of the world, inner peace and freedom. Although distinguishes in the Latin word conversio a polarity between the Greek words epistrophe, which means a change in orientation, and the word metanoia, implying the idea of a mutation and a rebirth. Therefore, Therefore, in the idea of conversion, there is an internal opposition between the idea of a return to the origin and the idea of rebirth. To Adolph's analysis of the notion of conversion, Foucault adds another example, the concept of conversio ad se, conversion to the self. A divergence between Hadot and Foucault emerges here. While Hadot sees epistrophe and metanoia as phenomena that permeate the entire Western tradition, Foucault points to a significant rupture within the Christian tradition, where metanoia, understood as a radical conversion of a break, comes to dominate. This notion of a metanoia has recently been highlighted as a defining characteristic within the autobiographic literary genres, as noted by Zappi. At some time, Periagouguet has been identified by Cusinato as a crucial element of philosophical conversion. Moreover, metanoia has been recognized as a key concept in phenomenological notion of epoche and utopian tradition. In this sense, the notion of conversion thus reveals its transdisciplinary nature. Um, well, no. Here we establish that spirituality is a key element of philosophy as a way of life, according to Foucault's and Hadot approach, with conversion as its central transformative process. What remains to be clarified is how we can differentiate between various forms of spirituality, particularly philosophical versus religious spirituality, and whether Hadot and Foucault's concept of conversion spirituality can lead to a comparative understanding of or epistemology of spirituality. According to what Hadot himself tells us about his mystical philosophical experience, spirituality takes on the character of an experience of authenticity that even when it is a philosophical experience, can assume the traits of the ineffable, the inexpressible, the epiphany that changes the worldview and the way we relate to the world. Starting from an experience that can be traced back, for example, to a primal experience of indivisibility between self and the world. Different spiritual practices seem to connect, in short, to one or more experiences of which we can say something, if not everything, and that therefore may require imagetic support and not majestic. Yeah, here to conclude, and to an experience of existence as an experience or as a test of both conversion appears as essential phenomenon. Well, just 30 seconds. On the other hand, Hadot, much like Foucault, is explicit in his intention to distinguish philosophy from religion. However, there are aspects within Hadot's thought that may lead to terminological confusion, as seen in the following case, and I quote, "But then, what do you do with religion in spirit and in truth, religion liberated from sociological and ritual aspects and reduced to an exercise in the presence of God?" I will answer, it belongs to the realm of wisdom or philosophy. Moreover, Hadot goes so far as to remove mystical phenomena from the religious sphere. To illustrate this, he cites the example of an atheist philosopher like Georges Bataille. On the other hand, philosophy is characterized from its very beginnings as a rationalizing critique of religious myths and symbols. But in cases like those of Iamblichus and Proclus, Hadot finds the intrusion of religion in philosophy as absolutely enigmatic. Furthermore, within the context of Eastern practices, Hadot himself admits many religions, such as Buddhism or Taoism, impose on their followers a philosophical way of life that includes spiritual exercise. What Hadot and Foucault do not address, indeed, is the issue of practices and experiences that exist on the border between religious and philosophical spirituality. However, by following the definitions of spirituality they propose and their approach to the contradictions that can arise in any philosopher, including themselves, it seems likely that all these experiences should be classified as simply spiritual. If we keep in mind at least two radically opposite and clearly distinguishable examples of religious spirituality and philosophical spirituality, we can observe, starting from the differences in practice, what unites them, the spiritual substratum we have spoken about, but also what separates them. The first model can be found in the spiritual exercise of St. Ignatius, whose goal is, let us remember, to seek the will of God, a practice that is therefore directed towards truth and transformation through truth within a framework of radical faith in the divine, which is unknowable, but to which supreme authority is attributed over the very inner experience. At the opposite extreme, to cite another example given by Hadot, but which we know was crucial for Foucault as well, we found the inner experiences of Bataille, characterized by systematic withdrawal from any external authority to the experience itself. On one hand, in the case of St. Ignatius, there is an absolute authority over spiritual exercise and experience, namely God. On the other hand, in Bataille, there is a complete rejection of any external authority. The inner experience is grounded in itself. Within this framework, one could analyze the spirituality based on the extent of faith in an external authority of one's experience, or conversely, the degree of critique. Between these two extremes lies a spectrum of intermediate situations where a minimum of faith would correspond to a maximum of critique into an external authority. Another table allows us to define spirituality based on what we might call a gradient of conversion, reflecting the greater or lesser commitment to fostering a transcendence of the subject in relation to the whole and a transformation of existence as a whole. Thank you very much, and sorry for exceeded all the time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we are a little over time. We have time for maybe one question before we take a break from the session, but I'd like to actually see if anyone online has a question, because we can all talk together during our lunch break, but they can't because they're online. So we can maybe prioritize that right now. David has a question? Oh, one on camera have a question?
There's no hands raised.
Okay, well, that's all right. We'll take one from the audience. then.
Here's one. Yeah, good.
Bartholomew, okay.
Did you have a question? Oh, then they said. Oh, you were right.
Shall I ask a question?
Yes, please.
I mean, there was an awful lot to take in there. But all that struck me was this borderline of religion and philosophy and spirituality. What struck me was, I mean, we went a lot into self-renunciation and kenosis, just focusing on one feature, if I've understood it properly. Within the welcoming structure of religion, I think there's a different kind of self-renunciation that Foucault is recommending than what goes on within the practices, to use Wittgenstein and language games, and inside a practice, whether that's the mystery of the Mass, if you're a Christian, or whether it's a Buddhist community. I wasn't really clear what you wanted to say, for example, about what happens after you die and afterlife. There's a lot of spirituality that engages directly with that. What would the philosophical spirituality you're emphasizing want to comment upon that? What can you actually say?
Just answer through those words, in the sense that religion can be seen as a codification of the spirituality. So all the ritual or the religious rituals somehow codificate some spirituality that can be present or not. Well, of course, philosophical spiritually can be seen, as we agree, in a similar way. There are maybe philosophical rituals as ours in academy, maybe, that are not spiritual in themselves. and codificate eventually some spiritual contents proper to philosophy.
Bartholomew, would you like to ask your question?
I don't have a question. I didn't ask.
So sorry, there was some confusion here.
I could make a tiny question to you, Gianfranco, now that you put me on the spot. I just noticed in the last slide the absence of Kierkegaard. I didn't want to bring a question up because I'll be talking about that tomorrow. But it was interesting that he was omitted, even though Hadot was obviously really, I mean, the chapter on the figure of Socrates, is it you left him out on purpose, or because being a kind of an explicitly Christian thinker, or was it just something that you hadn't thought about? Given that he's very much a figure that has, you know, even though he is a Christian thinker, but he has, as you know, so many different characters who try to make that conversion or deceive you into the truth from the ethical and the religious.
I think that is precisely proper to this to those cases of where the boundaries of spirituality and of conversion are very thin. So, but in the case of Kierkegaard, for instance, we can see as the choice of life is also made through the distress, no, through a negative opposition of this, and it's not reportable to the antiquity. Well, but I think that there are a lot of these very many cases of religious thinkers, as Bergson, for instance, also was. In which, well, the philosophical spirituality and the religious spirituality can be seen through the practices, but the boundaries are very thin, not very defined.
Thank you all so much. Well done.